So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find the Aramaic English translation of the word. And this translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage, so then we can understand the time of the end. As per Yeshayahu the prophet, we find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Mashiach laid waste for many centuries. As we read it in Yeshayahu the prophet, known as Isaiah, we then begin our quest with the understanding of the cities of the Mashiach then laid waste for many centuries, and then relating with what then later Shaul, known as Paul, then taught his people regarding then the completion of the spring feast. So then there is a point where then we find those who were from the faith of the Greco-Romans versus those from the faith of the Hebrews. And obviously there is a huge gap from both sides, because the understanding from the Spirit is not the same as understanding of the soul. So Peter, known as then Shimon, in his name, obviously it is the Aramaic nickname he had as far as rock. Then we find the understanding of the salvation of the soul extremely important, because not only we find then truths as far as the spring feast and the autumn feast, but then from what then Shaliach Shaul was explaining, known as the Apostle Paul. Then later we find him showing his people a path of understanding as far as then what the Hamashiach ben Yosef taught regarding then the completion of the Feast of Autumn. So then, as far as Mashiach or Hamashiach ben Yosef, is he coming at any time? No. The Mashiach then has some prerequisites that must take place prior of his return, if we understand, for instance, the fact of Yod He Vav He completing then the autumn feast. Now that's a situation where then we must understand then the fathers of the church versus then the reality of the original manuscripts, and that's where then the gap from both sides, then we must understand and close this gap. So we find then the Greco-Roman translation leading towards the understanding of the Spirit. You find in the Hebrew scripture related with the salvation of the soul. So then, either when we make an analysis, what Peter then or Shimon has stated as far as then the salvation of the soul, you find this if you read Shaliach Shimon. Now the Spirit obviously is related with the presence of the divine, and unfortunately because of the translation, this section has not truly clearly given via the Greco-Roman translation, because they do not have the content of the feasts included in their translation. So the best way of describing these, you have a specific amount of content that cannot be translated. Let's give an example of this situation. You find then Paul or Shaliach Shaul. He was, during the time of his travels, he made many remarks regarding then the timing of the feasts, because he wanted to be obviously in Jerusalem or then Yashurum during a period of the feast. So you do find this reality of the scripture. Now the Greco-Roman translation focuses principally on the spirit, while then the Hebrew scripture relates with the salvation of the soul. Now we begin our quest then understanding why then the translation gave the same person, Shaliach Shaul or then Paul. You find then in one translation he's related with the spirit, and in the other translation he's related with the soul. So these are facts, not talking about faith, only facts. And then we should scrutinize what then these Shaliach or then apostle was trying to say, because unfortunately the Greco-Romans, they have changed from the salvation of the soul, and they introduced the word spirit in many sections of the New Testament, and then the people sometimes they get confused as far as whom they are obeying. They are not dealing with a spirit, but they are dealing with themselves as they read the instructions, like any other prophet or any other person that was obedient. You find in David, you find Yeshayahu, known as Isaiah, you find Yirmiyahu, known as Jeremiah, you find in Amos, you find Daniel, you find Ezekiel, and you find yourself. There is no distinction from a person from the great prophets in each person when we are talking of faith. So then if you think you cannot compare yourself with Yeshayahu or Isaiah, you have the same value before the divine when you are then pondering your value as far as Isaiah or then Yirmiyahu or then Yeshayahu or then Daniel and Ezekiel. But because people were giving a translation that related with the spirit rather than the salvation of their souls, then they observe themselves far away from these great prophets. And because they do not have the facts straight, then these reflect on their understandings of faith. And then the distance from these great prophets and the people becomes so great that they simply give up. So they turn themselves into a life of sin because they say to themselves they can ever be like those. And the fact is, we are not truly scrutinizing the scripture as far as faith. We are scrutinizing as far as facts. So then, when people they give up the reading of the scripture, or they give up their life with the divine, they are doing this on their own. Because what they thought was the spirit truly is a lack of clarity regarding the salvation of their souls. So then, when you're participating in a church, Pentecostal for instance, you are not obligated of becoming under the guidance of a pastor. Your pastor is Yod He Vav He. If you want the simple terms of the divine guiding you, He is the very being responsible for whatsoever is in existence. He should be the guidance of those people who are themselves, in their own opinion, guides of others. But then you find that those people, they are faulty. That's why you find so many thousands of denominations, because when it comes to the point of understanding the soul versus the spirit, they do not give you the clarity of facts. And then sometimes people sin that because they were so indoctrinated in the spirit, everything is a spirit, a spirit, a spirit, what about their souls? When we read, for instance, what Shaul was doing, he was explaining the completion of the spring feast. Now, the point we should ask ourselves is, some of the writings of Shaul, known as Paul, there are some mysteries where then a lot of information he gave from the translation of the Hebrew script is related with salvation of the soul. And a lot of content only talks of the spirit. So what we should scrutinize as far as the New Testament, it is the influence of this kind of spirit that simply does not let the people become closer as then what the prophets were, or any important guide used by the divine many centuries ago. So people, when they have troubles in their lives, and when they do things that they should not be doing, then they devalue themselves and they simply give up. But the divine has the same value as the prophets of many centuries ago and your life. You are in equal terms as far as the importance of a human being. Now, what the churches are failing miserably is simply explaining the reality of the salvation of the soul, the facts involved with it. And these people who say themselves as pastors, they have put themselves there on their own. Can they become mentors of the others? Of course. But they should never control your life. Because if they can control your life, what should we do with your faith? Then the building up of your faith is not upon the scripture and the obedience. You work so hard, but then you are dependent upon another person. And salvation, as per Isaiah, the 43rd chapter, and from the 40th to 43rd, you find there is no salvation other than Yod He Vav He. So how can you put your trust in a pastor, being he or she? Should you devalue your mentor? No. As long as they teach you properly. As long as you are valuable, when you are then reading the scripture and understanding for what it is from the Hebrew perspective, then you scrutinize the many failures of translation. So then, as you probably have a scripture somewhere in your attic or then in your shelving, in your drawer, maybe you should consider a time of get the scripture back and make sure you understand yourself as valuable as the prophets were. Until you gather up some facts that can restore the importance of yourselves before the divine. Then you begin to understand the facts. And then as you understand the Hebrew script, then you begin to build your faith. So then, Shaliach Shaul, you find then he was from the tribe of Benjamin, and then he himself said, Hebrews of the Hebrews. So he is giving you an understanding from where he's coming from. Now, does it not, Paul said, imitate him as he was imitating Hamashiach ben Yosef? So the very language of Hebrew is already giving you the answers, without mixing with faith at the moment. So as you understand these ABCs of the Hebrew script, then you can restore your importance before the divine, but not in the enlightenment of a spirit, but the enlightenment of a fragile soul that obviously is learning. So then, was Shaliach Shaul infallible? No, in fact not. Shaliach Shaul, as we can read from this scripture, he said at some point, oh, I knew a man 14 years ago, and he was caught up then in the third heaven. He saw many things, he said, that he could not explain. So this person that Shaliach Shaul or Paul is speaking of, he's talking of himself. There are some very interesting sections in the Hebrew text when we begin our quest of understanding only the language. Then you find that this person, when he is talking of the spiritual realm, obviously he had built his faith first. Now, how can we experience the divine without building up our faiths? Can we do it? No. Because the spirit involved with a translation solely lacking content obviously is going to divert you from the truth, for the simple fact that lacks content. So then, re-evaluating the holy instructions from the enlightenment of the Apostle Paul, known as Shaliach Shaul, gives you a few glimpses that he is speaking of himself. So why then Shaliach Shaul was, for instance, involved in many fights? And he was beat up so badly, and he was left on the side, he was left for dead. Why so many times he was then involved in a fight? Because he was blind. The situation of the Shaliach Shaul then, or Paul, was then for 72 hours blind. Then later on came brother Ananias and then start praying for him. It's truly not the reality. It was not after 72 hours and he received his sight back. Trying to understand one situation as far as the divine. He is not mystical. It takes time. As then Moses, when he came out of Mitzrayim, or Egypt, he then went to the land of Midian. There then he met Jethro. Later then became his father-in-law, and he was his mentor for decades. So this situation of learning spiritual reality by osmosis, or a kind of a spirit that comes in and starts to direct you, it simply does not exist. Most principally if drives you away from the holy instructions in Hebrew. It's absolutely the typical understanding then, and the gap of a distance from the holy prophets and yourselves. Because mostly of the New Testament focuses on the spirit rather than the importance of the salvation of the soul. Now we are talking about fact. That's when people they get defensive, because they cannot relate fact and faith, and then they get defensive because they can't bear the understanding of somebody coming and showing them the reality of the Hebrew text. Now if we take the time and start reading the Hebrew text and understanding the multi-layer, then later on when you read Shaliach Shaul, you're going to understand it. It's not hard. In fact, when you begin to read the Hebrew script and later you begin to read the New Testament, you yourself, because you have developed your ability of reading the original manuscripts, you then start to piece it together. Pieces, and then the divine guides you. These bear truth because in Romans chapter 12, you find in Paul saying, renewing the mind with what kind of a scripture? The Torah, the Tanakh, or the Peshitta. That's what Shaliach Shaul is explaining, or then Paul. So then when the people they gather around, they don't gather around carousing around. They gather around to study. Because by doing this, then they are concerned with the souls of other people. So then, next time I'm going to make more evaluations of these people, such as Shimon, known as Peter, Shaliach Shaul, known as Paul, And then later we're going to find who is then this person Yod He Vav He. Can he be considered as a person? Or should we understand him as a divine force? Should we understand as revelation as the Mashiach coming, or Yod He Vav He in his function of Shafat or judgment? Now, people, they can't continue on the quest for the divine when the translation they have, they can't understand it. It takes time, but if we do a bit every day, a reading every day, learning every day, then we become acquainted. It takes a bit of discipline. It does. But if we set a goal every day for 10 minutes, then the divine is always there teaching. So next time I'm going to evaluate more of Shaliach Shaul, and then also the understanding of revelation regarding then what the prophets foretold many centuries ago. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.